Thank you all very much for being here, first of all, being, as it is, this almost the last session.
The last gasp.
Absolutely. And thank you, Imogen, for coming to present us your latest, two latest books, I would say.
Oh, I'm so excited.
So, okay. It's very difficult to place yourself as you are in this beautiful garden, in this beautiful city, or this wonderful country, in cold Russia, in the middle of a winter, when a revolution is impending and so many things are going on. So why Russia? It's not the first book you have written about Russia.
No.
So why Russia?
Well, this shows the power of books, by the way. So I read Crime and Punishment in my late teens and fell madly in love with Russian literature and decided that I was about to go to university to read French, and I thought, I'm not doing that. I'm going to do Russian and from scratch, and I'm going to learn the whole thing. So I fell in love with Russia very, very, very early on. It's been a sort of 35-year love affair. And so I was a young journalist, and in 1992, just as the Soviet Union was collapsing, I was sent by the then editor of the Mail on Sunday to travel from St. Petersburg, right up in the north, all the way through the southern states, right the way through the whole of the Soviet Union as it was falling apart. And I ended up in Sakhalin, which is just above Japan. And so I wrote this book, and I was 23. And while I was there, I heard about this story about these Montenegrin princesses.
Okay, so you pick up the story, and I would like you to tell us, because I sort of know, but maybe they don't. How did you hear about this story for the first time? How do you hear about these two women?
Well, I was in a kitchen in Moscow in 1992, and a friend of mine who was an old journalist said to me, Imogen, there's this most amazing story, you must hear it, about these two young women from Montenegro who married into the Russian court, and they were the women who brought in Rasputin into the court and basically single-handedly seemed to sort of accidentally destroy an empire. Because obviously Rasputin was the sort of speeded up the process of destroying the empire. So these women from Montenegro arrived, and they were extremely unpopular, and everybody hated them to the point that they were badly bullied and etc. Anyway, but the one thing that he told me, which was so magical, was he said they were called the Black Princesses because obviously they did black magic, and we'll come to that later on. But also, he said to me once, brilliantly, he called me from Moscow and said, Imogen, I found out why they were called the Black Princesses properly. And I said, what? He went, they had black eyes. And I thought that was something so magical. I thought that image of them has stayed with me forever, with their black hair and their black eyes, that sort of impenetrable stare that they had, which was quite disconcerting and quite scary, I think.
Yes, but when you decide to write this story, I mean, you've already written your first book about Russia at a very terrible time for Russia.
Yeah,
and
it was fascinating for me, but
yes,
not so much fun for them. Yes, yeah, true.
And then you had written the hugely successful Hotel Babylon.
Yeah, the Babylon series.
So, and we will back to that one. So,
yeah,
how different it was for you to write a historical novel, because your novel is full of historic detail. And by the way, I've cross-checked most of them, and they are accurate. But it is a different genre. It is a completely different adventure.
Yeah, true. Yes, exactly. And I think a few years ago, I had the great luxury of being an editorial consultant on a book called Belgravia by Julian Fellows, who is the man who wrote Downton Abbey. And so he's a sort of assistant, I suppose. And I would never have dared really written historical fiction had it not really been for him, because he taught me how to do it. And it's a very different, well, it is slightly like journalism in that it involves a lot of research, but at the same time, what you have to learn if you're writing historical fiction is how much detail you need to put in, because obviously what you want to do is show off how much you actually know. You've got to stop your ego from saying, do you know what I really know about tiaras? Let me just talk to you about tiaras for a second. And as an author,
and you could go on for an hour about tiaras.
I really could, yes. Or I could tell you about spells or lots of. Anyway, what you have to do is try and control yourself a bit. And then, of course, the subject that we are dealing with is women, and women very rarely bother the pages of history books. And mostly history is written by the men who win and the victors, and these women were neither. So the difficulty is with trying to research a book like this is you have to read 100 books in order to get 10 chapters.
Just a glimpse.
A glimpse of what they were like. And it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. So you're pulling together elements of this jigsaw, and eventually, hopefully, you try and get the full picture.
Okay, so let's go into women, because
Yes.
this is really a novel about two women making their life, the life of their families, in very tremulous times. So let's start with, they are two sisters, and that particularly caught my attention, because
Right.
you've got a sister and so do I.
I have my sisters here
Yes.
in the audience today, actually.
Right, so,
Yes.
So we know sisters' stories.
We love sisters. They're marvellous.
Right, excellent.
Yes.
So tell me how difficult or how easy was that for you, and why you chose. It's not the first time you choose sisters, though.
No, well, I like writing about sisters, because obviously it's my specialist subject, having got one. And what's interesting about writing about, it's about female relationships, actually, is what it is originally. But I mean, but there is a subset of sisters. And what's interesting about sisters is they have a terrible shorthand with each other.
Yeah.
So they can be incredibly rude, incredibly mean, but ultimately they have each other's backs. And that's very interesting about these two sisters who come from Montenegro. They are very much on their own. They have no support whatsoever, so they have to stick together. And they become this formidable band, the pair of them. And I think the strength, I think if they were friends, that would never have worked. Two friends from Montenegro, one of them would eventually got rid of the other one at some point. But I think, blood is obviously thicker than water, and they have to stick together. And together they make a pact to stick together.
And to protect each other.
But to protect each
and
other,
that
yes.
is the story. So the story, we will also talk about the sequel of the story, which
Yes.
is, the witch's daughter.
Yes.
That's another relation.
Yeah.
But one of the things that caught my attention, I hope you have read the novel, or you are going to read the novel soon. One of the things that caught my eye when I read it was one of the first episodes you narrate is actually a public, or rather, a miscarriage.
Yes, yeah.
By a prominent member of the nobility, almost in public.
Yeah.
And the shock that produces in the people people present in the banquet. It seems to me, and we were discussing this the other day, even when women write about women, or even when there are female characters in novels, all their biology seems to be absolutely silenced.
Yes.
And you give us this sort of moment of shock at the very beginning, because you start with a very visible, very shocking miscarriage of a woman who has been basically taken away in blood.
Yes.
So that is a statement.
Well, it is. I'm slightly laying out my picnic in front of you for you to have a look about what I'm going to write about. But also, it's a true story. So the two sisters come to St. Petersburg, and Anastasia gets married, and her marriage was obviously for convenience originally, but it is doomed from the start. And this public miscarriage from a very prominent woman, she was the Grand Duchess Vladimir, who was the richest woman in Russia at that point, one of the richest, and she has a double miscarriage at the wedding, and this was said to be a terrible omen for the marriage, and proved to be true. But when I found the story in one of my thousands of books that I read, I just thought this was a sort of extraordinary idea that something so awful could happen so publicly, and at a moment when it was supposed to be a joyful occasion for somebody else. And obviously, because they were steeped in mysticism, this was proved to be the most terrible sign that the marriage was doomed to failure.
Which it does.
Which it does fail, yes, obviously. No.
But then, the two sisters are in St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
They befriend the Tsarina.
Yes.
And as we know, because that is in every history book, her drama is not to produce soon enough a male heir.
Yeah.
And that when she produces a male heir, is actually a very feeble boy, extremely ill.
Yes.
Right? And that also brings back into the front picture the terrible idea that women have been, their place in society was almost just to breed children, and how that very anguished of very anguished Tsarina calls these women for help, because she really thinks that if she doesn't perform, the whole country, the whole fate of Russia is in her hands if she doesn't produce a male heir. I mean, the pressure you think there's still women have, maybe in our own countries, maybe in countries all over the place, for actually performing the duty that society imposes us as women. That you can do whatever you want, have a career, darling, whatever, but your role in society primarily is to have children that are healthy, and unfortunately in some countries preferably male.
Oh, always male. It's the question of succession, which anyone who watches Netflix will be obsessed with as well at the moment. But it is about succession. So in history, you can win as many wars as you like and gain as much territory as you want, and have as many diamonds and jewels and fabulous palaces as you want. But if you don't have an heir, you have nothing. And so the question of succession was huge, particularly in Russia at this point. The Tsarina arrived behind the funeral of his father, so the Alexander III. And so what's extraordinary is that she was already fated to fail, according to superstitions, because she arrived behind black prisoned horses, they were called. So then she had these four daughters in quick succession. And what is fascinating about their desire for a male heir is what you have to understand is how they announced the birth.
That moment is terrible.
It's just terrible. So if you lived in St. Petersburg during this period, you would sit around and you would wait for the cannon fire to announce what sex the baby was. So for a girl, you got 101 cannon salutes, whatever, and then for a boy, you got 303. So what's fascinating is if you think about how difficult logistically it is to actually fire a cannon. So imagine if you had one cannon shot a minute, so that's an hour of cannon, and an hour and 40 minutes of cannon, while you're sitting there waiting to hear if you've got the 102nd cannon shot. And at that point, if it stops at 101, the whole city just goes, oh, well, crikey, that's it then. Let's go out and do something else.
Another girl.
Yeah, another girl, who cares?
You have that in your characters. I mean, their hearts plummet when they don't suddenly silence. After 101 and then silence, and they think, oh no, there we go again.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. But also what's amazing, when you realise, is when they finally get the 303, so at 102, the restaurants start to open. At 103, they start the champagne. 104, everyone is out into the street. I mean, this is a huge sort of explosion of joy that comes out from St. Petersburg and ripples out into the countryside. And you can almost hear the wave going through the villages as the succession has been achieved. But of course, we all know that the poor boy was a haemophiliac, and that's when our witches really get going.
Yeah, and witches get going because they try to find someone to take care of that boy. And that someone is, it's almost like everybody's Harry Potter now, the one that cannot be named, which is Rasputin. Hundreds of books have been written about him, all those legends going around. He's not mentioned in the title, but he is certainly the character that vertebrates the second part of the novel.
Yes.
So tell us about, why did you...
In my book, they manifest him because they are witches, which is a bit of it's probably known as poetic license. But they call on him, and he arrives, and he walks from Siberia all the way, via Mount Athos, actually, in Greece. But then he arrives in St. Petersburg, and in terms of drama and character, he is... the gift that keeps on giving, Rasputin. I mean, from a writer's point of view, you just couldn't get better than him. He's a lightning rod for all things that are disgusting and awful and obscene. And at the same time, there's so much myth that surrounds him.
It's because very often, I think people from outside think that Rasputin almost like arrived at the court and sought a way of getting almost to the chamber,
the bedchamber.
The bed, but that's not really what the version you're giving of the events in the book. What you're saying is that he's brought in as someone who is, and could you please tell them, because I was when I was reading this, I thought like this cannot be true, and it in fact is true.
Yes.
The dog.
Oh yes.
Please tell them about the dog.
Oh, this is so bizarre. So the two sisters, the witches, meet Rasputin, and he's brilliant he's a sort of hypnotist, sort of guru, sort of faith healer type of a character. And they sort of slightly believe that he's possibly real, or they don't really know whether he can do what he do, because they've already brought in a few other gurus before who haven't really done their job very well. Anyway, so he's like the last throw of the dice, the last opportunity they have to really keep control of their Tsarina in the court. Anyway, so he arrives, and Anastasia, the younger sister, is married to Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, and he's been breeding borzois, beautiful dogs. And one of his dogs, his favourite dog, is very, very ill, and she's about to die. And anyway, so Rasputin is ushered out of the palace and into the stables back behind the palace, and he goes in and he heals the dog. And the dog is healed within about 2 or 3 minutes, whatever, of him caressing him, and with his bright blue eyes, the colour of a Siberian winter sky, staring into the dog, and the borzoi miraculously sort of resurrects and trots out of the stables, and they're all astonished. So therefore, he's now proved to be the guru that he actually is, and then he's introduced into the court. And I thought this was a total load of rubbish, this story. When I was researching, I think he can't possibly have healed the dog. This is ridiculous. Anyway, then I spent about 2 or 3 weeks really researching it, and I found in Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaivich's diary, this is absolutely true, that he goes in and he heals the dog in the stables. So that's how one of his sort of entrances into court is through that.
Okay, so he manages to get access to the Tsar, who at that time is not taking any decision. I mean, and we'll talk about the Tsar character a little bit later on.
Yeah.
And a very anguished Tsarina who needs someone to protect that child because they believe the future of Russia.
Yeah, well, he's the heir. I mean, the terrible thing is that she not only gives birth to this very beautiful boy, actually, but she's also the instrument of his downfall, because she's the one who carries haemophilia, because she was Queen Victoria's grandchildren, and Queen Victoria had managed to basically infect most of Europe with haemophilia with her cunning plan to marry all her grandchildren or children off to various courts around the world. And yes, so she was the one who bought her, she gives life to this boy, but also slightly, could possibly take his life away. So she's hounded by guilt. Right. Most of the time, and they realise that the little boy is not well very early on. There's a sort of description of he's bleeding from his umbilical cord, very the day 3 or 4 of him being alive, and they're trying to bind his waist to try and stop him. So the nervousness around him, you can imagine the sort of hysteria. He was carried by his Cossack bodyguard most of the time, so his feet never touched the floor.
Sorry.
Don't worry. No, so eventually they managed to get. So Rasputin was found as the new guru to try and help this boy from his various crises. If he'd fall over and cut his knee, to hitting simple things that you and I would not really feel anything. If you have haemophilia, when your blood doesn't clot properly, if you just hit your elbow or something, it can be terrible.
So can we tell them the truth or not?
Oh yes, yeah. So
should they know the truth?
Yeah, you can tell you the truth. So often I get asked, was Rasputin a real guru, or was he really a healer? And sort of going into it, I think he was very convincing. So there's lots of placebo effect, possibly the idea that he definitely calmed down the Tsarina. He was brilliant at hypnotism, and he was very good at calming the room. So you can imagine lots of very frantic people running around, trying to bandage the boy and all that sort of stuff. If somebody very calm walks into a room, it changes the atmosphere of a room. But one of the things that I did find out, which I thought was fascinating, was so one of Rasputin's big things that he used to say was, don't let the doctors bother him. So there were moments when the Tsarevich was very ill in bed, and there were plenty of doctors running around after him, and by saying don't let the doctors bother him, what he did inadvertently was the wonder drug of that period, the only new drug that they'd managed to discover was, of course, aspirin. And by saying, don't let the doctors bother him, the haemophiliac son was not given aspirin. And so aspirin, as you know, is a blood thinner. So the last thing you need on earth, if you have haemophilia, is to have your blood thinned even more. So maybe by just saying that, he saved the little boy's life.
Okay. So Rasputin is a big character in the novel. The witches, the sisters, are the main protagonists.
Yeah.
But you have a whole cohort of characters surrounding the court, and you describe their life in detail, the things they did, how they dressed, the places. I mean, you describe very well the life of all these people who suddenly are surprised because a revolution is coming and it's on the way. And I would like you, to, because that is narrated in the sequel,
Yes.
which is. Hold on a second, I will show you to the audience.
Oh.
This is the sequel, The Witch's Daughter.
Yes.
And you narrate very well how all these people are completely taken aback when things start unraveling in St. Petersburg and they say, what is going on?
I know, it's extraordinary. It's like, I mean, I've been listening to lots of things during this beautiful festival, and somebody said a line about history being written by the people who were left behind. And I suddenly think, we all know that with hindsight, what was happening with the revolution. But I think maybe if you were living there, you didn't really think beyond what you were having for breakfast. Certainly if you read the Tsar's diary, that's all he thinks about is what he's having for breakfast and what a lovely walk he had. And there's this thing sort of called the boiled frog. The idea that if you put a frog in a sort of tepid water and you slowly turn up the temperature, it just gently falls asleep and doesn't realise it's being killed. I mean, there's a lot of the idea that lots of these people, they simply didn't believe. They had such immense privilege and they were so disassociated from real events that they genuinely didn't think anything so ghastly and grubby like that could happen to them. And it's not until right at the very end, when St. Petersburg is practically on fire, or Petrograd as it was called then, is that they actually decide to leave. And it's extraordinary that they took so long. I mean, and so there's a mass exodus out of St. Petersburg.
Which is, you narrate in the sequel.
Yeah, in the sequel, yeah. And as the whole of the country burns, they finally end up in the Crimea. And we've also been talking at this festival about fake news.
Yeah.
And there's a terrible moment where the dowager is sitting on the Tsar's mother, sitting on her lawn in the Crimea, having a champagne picnic. And some equerry runs up and says to her, my lady, your son, the Tsar and the Tsarina and all their children have been murdered in Yekaterinburg. They've been shot. And she sort of sits there with her glass of champagne and sort of hesitates for a second and goes, that can't possibly be true. And it's like fake news. And so
she refuses
to believe it, and she carries on with her picnic. And for us, it's shocking because we know that's true. But she just didn't believe what was being told to her most of the time, I think.
Right. And the sequel also starts because one of the two sisters has a daughter.
A daughter, yeah.
Nadezhda.
Yeah.
Who supposedly might have, we are not going to say whether she has or hasn't, inherited some of those powers that the mother had.
Yes.
So, and then I was absolutely, taken aback because when you read the descriptions in the book about the seances, you clearly had done that. I mean, you couldn't.
Oh, the seances,
yes, all these sort of psychic thing. You couldn't have written about it with such detail unless you have. And I thought, oh, she's been there.
Well, I'd studied all of this at the London College of Psychic Studies. So in order to work out, how to do spells, how to do, I did crystal ball reading, I did tarot, I did palmistry, and I learnt mediumship at this incredible school in London called the London College of Psychic Studies, which was originally set up in about sort of 1890. By the Victorians, who took their mysticism and occultism very, very, very seriously, and it was to be studied. And then it was taken over by Arthur Conan Doyle, who you probably all know who he is. and Sherlock, obviously, and he took over the college in just after the First World War, when obviously so many people had lost their brothers, their husbands, their lovers, and their fathers, and everyone wanted to contact the dead people to talk to them. So spiritualism really seriously took off then. And the London College is this amazing place. I always describe it as Hogwarts for grown-ups. It's basically teaching you how to be a witch. It's really brilliant. And
so that can be taught?
Well, I had a go.
Successful?
Successful. Well, I learned, I mean, what's amazing is, as a writer, rarely do you get proper input into sort of like opening up your third eye, the idea of creative imagination, the idea of thinking slightly differently. And what's amazing about that school is it really teaches you to think differently. I mean, even something very basic, which is called tassomancy, which is tea leaf reading. I learned to read tea leaves. You can scry, which is crystal ball reading, which is reading images in the sky. You can there's no such thing as coincidence as soon as you cross that threshold. And there was an amazing moment. I was sent there by a friend of mine called Jessica Adams, who is a medium, and I said to her, there's an incredible library in the college, which is there's a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle's original big fat leather-bound books in there, which are wonderful. And I was trying to find books on spells and herbs and things, which I use in the book. And I said to her, how will I find these books? And then she said, just stand in the library and they will make themselves known. So I was thinking, what do you mean? So I just stood there.
Scary,
it was quite scary. And I was standing there thinking, okay, I'll have you. It was good.
So from the time you hear the first anecdote about the sisters until you actually wrote the book, there are a few years.
30.
Blimey, that's a long time.
30 years, yeah.
Right, and then you write the sequel. And let me tell you, when I think if you read them, you should read one after the other. And I'm going to, maybe you agree. The first, which is in St. Petersburg, is really about the imperial Russia.
Yeah.
It's a decadent empire. It's a plotting court. It's a feeble Tsar. It's a royal family enclosed within themselves, completely out of touch of what's going on.
Yeah.
And then suddenly the revolution happens.
Takes them by surprise. Yeah.
And takes them all by surprise. And that daughter is the witness to horrors, one after another. But she takes a different stance upon the whole thing. And so it's almost like the first book is Imperial Russia. The second book is really the collapse of everything. And, the last scene is when they are actually almost like we're talking about migration this morning. I mean, flowing, leaving Crimea in little boats as immigrants with pockets of earth, right? As if they were crossing from Calais to Dover, desperate. I mean, how did you see the whole sequence of the historical sequence of all that? Desperate times. I think they had no idea what was happening to them. I think they were incredibly naive, actually. And it was incredibly violent. And when I was writing this book, the war with Ukraine just started. And I'd studied in Ukraine. I was at university in Kiev. And so all those places that they were talking about on the news, I really knew, and it felt very personal and very strange. And what's interesting is the level of violence that they've meted out in Ukraine is exactly what they did to each other in the revolution, and it's quite shocking actually to read. And so I think maybe in retrospect, maybe I made it a bit too violent when I was writing it, because I was so upset that what was happening in real time. I just felt there was this outpouring of sort of grief from me in the book a bit, and so it feels a bit more Gone with the Wind than I'd anticipated, actually, although I flatter myself because that's one of the best books ever written and won the Pulitzer. But it's very much more violent than I thought it was going to be.
But yes, they do escape, and they escape. And they are rescued like refugees off the beaches by the British. Finally, the British come and rescue them in a boat called the HMS Marlborough, and they're all packed in, and they're all, they've got sort of jewellery sewn into their clothes, and Prince Yusupov has got a rolled-up Rembrandt which he's managed to get off his wall, and I mean the stuff they take is extraordinary. And I have a girlfriend who's just had to leave Russia recently, and her father was on that boat, the HMS Marlborough, as a baby. And she was in St. Petersburg recently trying to work out what to pack, because she was leaving, again, like her father did, a generation later. And she just said, I don't know what to take. What would you take? And she does have a life in the UK, but it was quite surreal for her to be picking up the same photograph frames that he'd obviously picked up.
100 years before.
100 years before, yeah.
It's such a terrible thing. And then two things, before I give, the voice to people maybe who would like to ask questions in the audience, one or two things I wanted to highlight, which apart from all the detail that you give about the clothes and the everything they're dressing, the smells.
I'm obsessed with the smell.
The smells. I mean, you spend half of the time reading the book going, because you are actually getting all these descriptions, from rotting corpses to perfumes to tea leaves, and I mean, how important is that when to get the message across, isn't it?
You're so funny you say that, because somebody once said, actually, when I wrote all those Babylon books, somebody wrote, Imogen Edwards-Jones is obsessed with crisps. And I didn't, and that's actually true. And nothing I like more than a crisp. And I said, but I didn't realise I'd actually written about crisps obsessively in all my books. But with the witches, I think I remember reading Scott Fitzgerald once, and he'd written this amazing phrase when he said he walked into a shop and it smelt of stale cigarettes and spilt soda water. And that's all he said about the shop, and I knew exactly what it was like. And I think you've got 5 senses to appeal to when you're writing in a book, and I think something like smell often gets overlooked. So I've cleared to have overly compensated in my book. But I think, if you tell people what it smelt like, they know where they are. And it smelt disgusting, mostly, St. Petersburg, especially after the thaw. So during the revolution, all the pipes froze. So all the sewage was frozen in the pipes. And then come the great thaw of, March or April, whatever it was, there was like a sluice that came out onto the streets. And you can imagine how disgusting that was. And, St. Petersburg, it is when in the summer and when it's hot, it really, it's quite whiffy.
No, absolutely. But also the fact that because it's a historical novel and you want to take the reader to feel that we are in that place.
Yeah.
Smells are so evocative.
Yes.
They are. You can see the descriptions of things, but the smells are really evocative. They really take you there.
Yeah, forget the jewellery. What does his breath smell like?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the much better way where bringing somebody to a party.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? She had a very nice dog's collar thing on.
Right. And then opens his mouth.
Exactly. It's much better.
Okay, so with that wonderful note, I would like now to ask the audience for the few minutes that we have left, whether there are some questions, and I see a few hands, so maybe we could have some wandering microphones. There's a lady in the yellow over here on the side, and there is a gentleman in green over there, so maybe we could... Thank you.
Thank you. So throughout this session, you've discussed themes of feminism, and one way that I could think of also how, men who are victorious write history and they discredit non-canon feminist narratives is by questioning the intentions and the sanity of women. Like during the witch trials, all witches are evil, so they must be killed, but all feminists are evil, so they must be witches, so they must be killed as well. Or all feminists are crazy, so they must be lobotomized. And even right now, even as it's gotten better, we still do live in a space where feminism is often discredited in terms of, they're just a feminazi, or what a killjoy feminist, So how do you practice non-compliance to the patriarchy in a space like this? Do you just not care about those narratives? Do you work on saying, no, maybe I'm a little bit sane? How do you sort of explore feminism in a space that works constantly to discredit those ideas?
What a brilliant question.
I know her. She's a brilliant student.
That's utterly fabulous. Well, I think all tricky women all over hundreds of thousands of years have been called witches. And I think, for hundreds of years, in the UK, we tried to drown them, and it was called witch ducking. And not hilariously, but I mean extraordinarily, if they survived, then they were told they're witches, and the ones who drowned were not. So it was a sort of lose-lose situation. Every difficult woman throughout history has been labelled as either mad, insane. They've always tried to be locked away. I mean, the terrible thing is, we were talking earlier about these women. They had no traction, they had no power, they had no control over what their lives were like. They were only supposed to produce children, and that's why I fell in love with these two, because they refused to take it sitting down. They decided to create their own fate. But yes, I agree with you. I think a witch is a difficult term, but I think we're now beginning to own it a bit more.
Absolutely. There was a gentleman over there with the hand in the back. Yes, in green, I think, if I'm not completely colorblind from here.
Hi. This is the first time I've been described as the gentleman with a hand. Thank you. First of all, I genuinely appreciate the idea of magic. And I love the themes that you mentioned about survivalism, about maternity and succession. So I correlate them through the lens of perceptivism. So I have two questions. One, how do you think the perception of magic and its cyclic relationship with folklore and propaganda influence politics and regional political discourse, if at all? And secondly, this is something that I really love about your work. On the topic of survivalism, do you feel that the sensory experiences, be it sight, smell, sounds, are inherently weaved into witchcraft by design?
Oh, another good question.
Two good questions,
yes,
actually.
Two, yeah.
You only have about 6 minutes. So
Yeah.
You better hurry up.
Yes, well, I think witchcraft is all about senses and perceptions, and the interesting thing is that the reason why it's sort of on the wane is because we don't listen to our senses and our perceptions very much. I mean, there's a passage in the book when they go to collect herbs together, and I think they with the dew of the midsummer morning dew, and I think we were much more connected with nature and things around us than we are now. And I remember in one of my courses I did at the London College, we taught to listen to our emotions more, and one of them said, if you have a premonition about something, you should really listen to it, because it's a pre-emotion. So it's an emotion that will affect you at some point, and if you listen to your premonitions, and you're much more in touch with your psychic self, you're much more likely to make the better choices than the ones that you're making at the moment.
And the question about propaganda?
Oh my, I can't even begin to unravel that one.
The question about propaganda, I mean, there is another, at the back, a couple of questions there. Oh, well, there's Yep, lady, yep. You can give it to the lady first, and then we go to the back. Thank you.
Hi, I want to compliment you on a very sensitive novel. I'm definitely picking it up. I had a question. I think with women like Jennifer Lopez, very empowered 21st century women, they are not afraid of being called bitches. And they even get on a microphone, people like Oprah Winfrey, and they're like, hey, bitches, how's it going? I wanted your response to the 21st century idea, because women are doing witchcraft openly and they're calling themselves Wiccans and white witches. How do you negotiate what's happening with the 21st century woman saying, I am magical, I possess natural power, and I'm in tune with nature?
Another good question. I think there's a difference between a bitch and a witch, to be honest with you. I think that there's a huge rise in witchcraft at the moment, particularly in the UK, and lots of women are calling themselves witches. I'm not sure whether putting a bit of patchouli oil on your forehead really makes you a witch, or whether being able to do a bit of tarot makes you a witch. I think it is a very serious thing, and there are generations of women, sort of mavens, who've done this over centuries. So I think we're sort of slightly deluding ourselves that just because I've got some hot pants on, and I'm in a crop top, that I might be a witch or
Yeah,
a bitch.
and actually there you make it very clear in the second book, because what the daughter is trying to save is a book. And I'm sorry, because that is maybe for my sort of manuscript
Your book,
studies
a
thing,
book.
my part of the world.
Yeah.
But, at the end, all the knowledge of these women,
Yes.
she collects in a book that she tries to entrust someone to save. So it's as if she's passing. This is no nonsense. I mean, this is really researched and
Yes. Yes, I know exactly, and all the spells on the book are real. I've been researched properly with all the correct herbs. I mean, a lot of it is sort of herbology. The idea of because they didn't have any things to help you, so tinctures and things like that. There's lots of taking of henbane, which I don't know if you've ever read about, which actually does make you feel like you can fly. Apparently, I haven't actually taken it. I think perhaps I should.
maybe you should write about it in the next one.
Yes.
I think there was a question of a young man over there at the back. Yes.
Good evening. Yes. So I would take my predecessor's questions a bit further and match that what they said about the taking it off the mainstream and ideas, because Rasputin, in my understanding, was a performer more than and he was able to spread non-mainstream ideas, which is and females particularly with respect to their biology and with respect to their currently their sexuality even tend to actually be able to spread with, and given the current level of bypassing your reasoning skills and persuasion and influence that our leaders and try to bring about compliance. So how do you try and bridge the gap between compliance and non-compliance, as you may have studied at the London College of Psychic Studies?
That's for you. I have a last question here at the front, so yeah.
What you must remember that Rasputin was a member of a sort of sect called the Callisti, which he believed that you could atone for your sins, but you had to sin first. So, but he was very expert at getting young ladies to sin, particularly in his own bedroom quarters. And the idea was that if you hung out with Rasputin and sinned with him, then you would be atoned for any other sins that you could have. I mean, I think it was basically a form of coercive control myself.
I think that this goes back to the propaganda question
Yes,
of the gentleman
exactly,
before.
yeah.
How what a wonderful way to sell yourself and
Yes.
your power. You sin with me and then I heal you.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good one, huh?
Yeah.
That's a good one. I think the last question is going to go to the gentleman with the hat. Oh, you also have a question, sir? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
I
yeah.
wonder, am I audible? I hope it is in context. We've been talking about the women and vis-a-vis the men. If you remember, in the 15th century in the Central Asia and also in India, you must have seen Mughal rulers who had empowered women like anything. One of the character, which famously known as Gulbadan Begum, was the sister of Babur, who was empowered with so much of power that she used to own ports in those days, and she used to trade Far East, and she used to take the delegations of the women all over the world. Okay, so in those days, say talking of the 15th and 16th century, there's so much of empowerment of women in the Mughal era and in the Central Asian countries where these people came from. So we talk of the Rasputin times where the women were women were considered to be bad, and when they were born, and all those canons you are talking about. So what do you say about the eras of those times and present times when Rasputin story that you have marketed?
Yeah. Do you let me? So he's asking. I have an answer for that one, but the idea is, I mean, he's pointing out very clearly that there were exceptionally women in here, for example, in the Mughals, and also in some parts of all the other parts of the world, where you have recorded the name of one extraordinary female who had was very powerful. He had her own means, her own court, her own decisions. And he's asking you about the difference between that and your Saturn. And my only footnote to that, sir, with your permission, is that yes, we know the name of one, but we don't know the names of the thousands and millions that were never recorded, because for one name that we know, we have thousands who were completely silent all over but then I am not the author, so.
But I will tell you one story about how terrible it was to be a woman during this period, even if you were a princess. So these girls, the Montenegrin princesses, while their mother was giving birth to 12 children, their father was building a nunnery down the road in the middle of a lake to shove them all in if he couldn't get them married off. So you could see your fate being built right next door to you if you didn't do what he said and go off and get married to somebody else or do your father's bidding. There was, a nice little Airbnb round the corner waiting for you.
Can I have time for one last question of the young man over there? Yeah? Yeah, just one. Since we are almost at the end of the festival.
That's very kind. Thank you very much for the talk. I just wanted to ask, because we've talked a lot about mysticism and spiritualism, that's very much in the Orthodox faith, and I wanted to, you mentioned that Rasputin had come via Mount Athos. I wanted to ask, how much was he able to operationalize Orthodox faith in this sort of occult, mystic setting?
You're completely correct. They were absolutely aligned. Sort of mysticism and Orthodox religion were almost sort of symbiotically rubbing against each other. So it was absolutely fine to go and talk to dead people in the afternoon, just so long as you actually went to church later on. I mean, it's like Catholicism as well. There's the idea that they're incredibly interconnected. I think it's to do with sort of heightened spirituality, and they didn't seem to find it remotely contradictory. Whereas in the Church of England, which as I know more about, is absolutely, you can't possibly do anything like that.
The orthodoxy you certainly has, so that's straight, yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for your wonderful questions. Please, Imogen Edward-Jones. Thank you.